Pivot tables are my favorite feature in all of Excel. We're going to start here. We're going to open a file, use File, Open, choose Project Files, and let's go to Lesson 2 and open the O1 Pivot Tables file. The data set that we're going to be working with in this lesson is about 1,200 rows. We have region, product, date, customer, quantity, revenue, cost of goods sold, and profit. The great thing about a pivot table is that we can summarize this data without using any formulas at all. If you can click and drag, you can create a pivot table. Let's dive right in and create our first pivot table. One of the frustrating things about Excel 2007 is figuring out where they moved the old commands from Excel 2003. Now, pivot table used to be on the data menu in Excel 2003. This is the one I can't figure out. They moved it to the Insert ribbon in Excel 2007. Choose the Insert ribbon. Make sure that you have one cell in your data set selected. And on the Insert ribbon, choose the top half of the pivot table icon. This is actually an icon with a drop down at the bottom and a button at the top. We want to use the button at the top in order to create a pivot table. The first thing that Excel asks us about is where our data is located. Provided that you have no blank columns or blank rows, Excel will guess this correctly, and you can click OK. In the lower half, you can choose whether you want to create the pivot table on a new worksheet or out to the right on an existing worksheet. I'm going to choose New Worksheet, so click OK. Now, if you've used pivot tables before in Excel 2003, you'll notice that this is completely different. One of the things that was very frustrating for anyone who is new to pivot tables in Excel 2003 was they would tend to drag fields to the wrong place. In Excel 2007, Microsoft has changed the paradigm. Rather than dragging fields from the pivot table field list onto the worksheet, they now have you drag fields from the pivot table field list to one of 4 drop zones right in the pivot table field list. Let's create our first pivot table. Let's say that we want to create a summary of revenue by region and product. First thing we do is click the region field. You'll see that the region is added to the row labels area of the pivot table, and we see a unique list of regions in column A of the worksheet. The next thing to do is click the product field. Now, because the product field contains text, it automatically is added to the row labels area of the pivot table field list. In this case, I would like to have the products going across the top of the report, so I'm going to take the product field and drag it from the row labels drop zone to the column labels drop zone. And we have a unique list of products going across row 4. Now we need to add one more field to the report, and that's what we want to total. In this case, we could either choose to total quantity, revenue, or profit. Let's choose revenue. Because my data set includes all numeric values in the revenue field, it's automatically added to the sum values drop zone. Now, if you happen to have a couple of blank cells, or worse yet, a little bit of text in the revenue field, it would be added to the row labels or the column labels area, and you would have to drag it to sum values. Let's take a look at this pivot table. It's an amazing thing. We just summarized 1,200 rows of data without using any formulas at all. If you can click and drag, you can create a pivot table. The other fantastic thing about a pivot table is that it's very easy to change the report. Let's say that you print this report and you take it to your manager. Invariably, the manager is going to say, well, wait a second, this is what I asked for, but not exactly what I wanted. I want products going down the left-hand side and regions going across the top. Very easy to change this in a pivot table. I want to take the region field and move it from the row labels drop zone and drop it to the column labels drop zone. And then I'm going to take the product field and move it from the column labels drop zone and drop it in the row labels drop zone. Just that quickly, I've completely changed the complexion of the report. If you need to add new fields to the pivot table, you can simply either check them in the top half of the pivot table field list or just drag them from the top half of the pivot table field list and drop them in the appropriate place. For example, let's say that we wanted to add customer to this report. There's 2 places along the left-hand side where we can add the customer field. We could show each customer in column A, and then within that show the products they've purchased. In order to do that, we would drop the customer field before the product field in the row labels area. That's one view of our data. It also might make sense to show the product field first in column A, and then show the customers who purchased that product. We would simply drag the customer field and drop it below the product field in the row labels area. Completely different report. It shows each product and the customers who purchased that product. Notice how easy it is to completely change the report simply by dragging fields throughout the report. If there's a field on the pivot table that you need to remove from the pivot table, fairly easy to remove it. You have 2 choices now in Excel 2007. The easiest way is simply to uncheck the field in the top half of the field list. The other method is to grab the field from the bottom half of the field list and drag it back to the top. When the mouse pointer changes to a black X, you're about to remove the field from the pivot table report. Let me add the products back to our pivot table. And anyone who's been using pivot tables since Excel 2003 is probably screaming, saying, what exactly is this new view of the data? Look in column A. You'll notice that column A now contains both customers and products. That's unlike anything we've ever had in the last 5 versions of Excel. How can it be that Excel is putting 2 different fields in that same column? This is a brand new view, and it's called the compact view. Microsoft likes this view so much that they made it be the default view for all new pivot tables. While I admit that this is a pretty cool view, it might drive you crazy if you're hoping to take this data from a pivot table later and use it in a new analysis. Once a pivot table is selected, we have 2 new ribbon tabs: the Pivot Table Tools Options and Pivot Table Tools Design. In order to change from the compact view to one of the traditional views, we need to go to the Design ribbon. Along the left-hand side, you see icons in the Layout group. The Report Layout icon is actually a drop-down. And there are 3 layouts. Compact Form is the view that we see right now. Outline Form is the view that you are familiar with from Excel 97 through Excel 2003. And Tabular Form is the other, although a bit more obscure view that was available in prior versions of Excel. Let's take a look at the 3. Currently we have Compact Form, which shows us both customers and products in column A. If I choose Outline Form, then we have customers in column A and products in column B. This is the view that you're probably used to. If we choose Report Layout and Tabular Form, you'll notice in Tabular Form that the totals move to the bottom of each section. We actually have control in Compact Form and Outline Form whether the totals appear above or below the data set, but in Tabular Form is sort of the older form, and it always has to have the totals at the bottom of the form. Other new options that we have in the Layout group, we can choose whether or not the subtotal should appear at the top or the bottom of each group. We can also choose whether or not there should be a blank row after each section. Blank rows are only available in Compact Form and Outline Form. I choose Outline Form and then blank rows, insert blank row after each line. You'll notice that between each customer there is a blank row. This blank row kind of helps the eye to follow from one section of the report to the other. Now I want to go back to the compact view. There must be a reason that Microsoft made this be the default view. There must be some really cool things, some things that caused them to completely change from the same view that we've had for the last 10 years to the new view. Under Report Layout, if I go back to Compact Form, and I'm going to go back to the Options tab of the Pivot Table Tools. I need to choose one of the customers, so I'm going to click on cell A5. You'll notice that we have a couple of new icons, the Expand Entire Field and Collapse Entire Field, that show up in the Active Field group of the Options ribbon. Watch what happens when I say to collapse the entire field. We get a beautiful view that just shows us customer totals. I can imagine having a projector and being in a meeting showing this workbook. Someone will say, well, we want to see the detail behind one particular customer. You can simply click the plus and expand the view for that customer. The plus changes to a minus. If you need to then collapse, click the minus sign, and you can hide the detail. I agree that this is kind of a cool view, and I appreciate the fact that Microsoft allowed us to discover it by making it be the default view in pivot tables. You have to be aware that if you don't like this view, just stop by the Design ribbon to choose one of the old legacy views. I'm going to remove the blank rows, and that wraps up our look at the new views and options in the Layout group of the Pivot Table toolbar. Well, hey, so far we've talked about 3 of the drop zones of the pivot table, the column labels, the row labels, and the sum values. We haven't looked at the report filter drop zone at all. The report filter is a great feature in pivot tables. If you've been using pivot tables in earlier versions of Excel, it used to be called the page fields area. We need to reset this pivot table a little bit, so I'm going to go back to the Options tab and say that I want to expand the entire field so that way we can see both the customers and products that exist. I'm going to take the customer field and move it from the row labels area up to the report filter area. Now you see that we have a simple pivot table with products going down the left-hand side and regions going across the top. At the intersection of each product and region is the revenue. We have a new drop-down that appears in cell B1 right next to the customer heading. This drop-down initially says all, but if we open the drop-down, we can choose one specific customer. And now we see the revenue by region and product for that one particular customer. This feature has been in pivot tables for a long time, but Excel has dramatically improved it in Excel 2007. I'm going to choose the drop-down again, and I'm going to expand this dialog box so we can see all of our options. The expand indicator are the 3 dots in the lower right-hand corner of the dialog box. If I click those and drag out, I'll be able to enlarge this dialog box. This is a great new feature in Excel 2007. Before, we were always stuck with the tiny little drop-down boxes. Now, you'll notice that we have a list of all of our customers. If I want to see just one customer, just as in Excel 2003, I would click that customer. But we have a new option in the lower left-hand corner called Select Multiple Items. Once I've selected multiple items, I can either choose to show 2, 3, 4, or 5 customers, or all customers by clicking the All button. Let's say that for some reason, I need to see the first 5 customers in the list. Excel now shows me the totals for those 5 customers. One complaint that I have is that in cell B1, they've indicated that I've selected multiple items, but they have not told me which items I've selected. I appreciate that it's a great feature that I can choose multiple customers. Let's say there were divisions of a company and I needed to choose all those divisions. The problem is it's very hard if I print this report to understand what items I've selected. I might even want to put a little note somewhere as a footnote saying that these are the customers that are included in the pivot table. There's another great use for the report filter fields. I've seen people build executive information systems where they actually take all of their text fields and move them to the report filter. Let's do that. Then take all of their numeric fields and add them to the sum values area. We've now created a very simple ad hoc reporting tool. Anyone, even the vice president down the hall, could open this workbook and select a particular combination of region, product, and customer and see the total that was sold to that combination. Now, of course, you and I know the VP is never going to do this. They're still going to call you, but at least the concept is there. Let's try it. I'll choose all customers and then say that I just want to see the North region for the A354 product. The pivot table automatically redraws to show us the revenue, quantity, cost of goods sold, and profit for that combination. I could do this all day, choosing different combinations of customer, region, product, and date. Makes a great ad hoc reporting tool using the report filters, just as we've had in several versions of Excel. Now, beyond this, Microsoft has added a filtering feature to fields that are in the row labels and column labels area. We need to rearrange our pivot table in order to see this, so I'm going to unselect quantity, cost of goods sold, and profit. I'm going to move the customer field to the row labels area. I now see all the customers who purchased this particular product in this particular region. In order to use the new filters, they're actually hidden. It's amazing. If you look in the pivot table field list, the customer appears twice. There's a customer entry in the top of the pivot table field list and a customer entry in the bottom of the pivot table field list. At all times, in the bottom of the pivot table field list, we see a drop-down next to customer. That's not the drop-down you want to use. You actually have to use the drop-down that's next to the customer in the top half of the pivot table field list. Now you're looking and you say, oh wait, there is no drop-down. You have to hover over the word customer and a drop-down appears. Choose the drop-down and you'll see the great new filtering options available for fields in the row labels and column labels area of the pivot table. If I open the label filters section, we can build filters where we say we only want customers that begin with a certain letter or contain a certain word, greater than a certain value, or between some range of values. Depending on the type of field that I have, we might have date filters or value filters appearing in this drop-down as well. Excel takes a look at the data. If 90% of your fields are dates, then you'll get date filters. If 90% of your fields are values, you'll get value filters. And if 90% of your fields are text, then you'll get the label filters. The value filters allow us to say that we only want to see customers who have revenue greater than $50,000 or less than $100,000 or between one value and another. All of these filters are brand new in Excel 2007. The only filter that's not new is the top 10 filter. This filter will allow us to see the top 10 customers, the top 5 customers, or the bottom 2, bottom 10, bottom 20 customers. That feature was in Excel 2003, but frankly, it was buried and very few people could ever find it. Well, I kind of have to admit that it's still buried in Excel 2007 because you have to think to hover over the customer field in the top half of the pivot table field list in order to see these new filters. Well, hey, let's walk through a quick example of how you would set up a top 10 filter. But first, I want to rearrange my pivot table a little bit so that way we get all of the customers back in the pivot table. I'm going to take the product field and move it to the column labels area. I'm going to take the region field and remove it from the report filter, and take the date field and remove it from the report filter. I now have a list of all of my customers going down the left-hand side and the products going across the columns. If I want to see a list of just the top 10 customers, I would have to hover over the customer field in the pivot table field list. Click the drop-down, choose Value Filters, and then Top 10. I can ask to see the top or bottom 10, 15, 5, 7, whatever. Either items, percent, or sum. Sum is a brand new feature based on sum of revenue. So let's say that I want to see the top 5 customers. I would change the spin button to show top 5 items by sum of revenue, click OK, and Excel will show me just the top 5 customers. If instead I want to see the customers who make up the top 80%, I would go back to the customer filter dropdown, choose Value Filters, Top 10, and say that I want to see, instead of the top 5 items, the top percent, and use the spin button to move up to 80. It's a frustrating field. It goes kind of fast. You have to go up, down. So now we are asking to see the top 80% based on sum of revenue. Click OK. And this time, instead of a specific number of customers, I'm going to get the customers that make up at least 80% of revenue. Now, of course, due to rounding, this may be 82 or 83%. It makes sure to give me enough customers so that way I can see the 80%. The last option, and this option is brand new in Excel 2007, is to see the customers that make up a certain amount of revenue. Let's say that I want to see the top customers who account for $5 million of revenue. I'll go back to my customer filter dropdown, choose Value Filters, and then choose Top 10. Change the percent to be sum. All right, now this one is crazy. I'm really not going to use the spin button to go from 80 up to 5 million. So luckily, they allow me to type a number here. I'm going to highlight the 80 and then type 5 million. Click OK, and I see just the customers who are enough to account for $5 million in revenue. In this particular case, if they had given me 3 customers, I would have been just shy of 5 million. 4 customers gives me 5.9 million. Again, they make sure to give you enough customers to match the number that you say. This new option is pretty cool. I can imagine lots of situations where we're looking for the largest customers or the largest products or the largest whatever that hit a certain item, and this is a great add to Excel 2007. That's the top 10. Now, I'd also like to show you the date filters. And in order to do that, we're going to add date to our pivot table. I'm going to remove the customer field by unchecking it and add the date field by checking it. You'll see that we now have dates going down the left-hand side of the pivot table. If we open the filter dropdown for the date field, instead of text filters, I now have a date filters option. The date filters, kind of a reminiscent of the filters in QuickBooks. They give me all sorts of logical concepts, such as all of the dates that are today, or next week, or last month, or this quarter. And the beautiful thing about this is, as I open the workbook later, for example, if I open it next week, the virtual or the logical date filter will automatically pull the dates that fall in that particular week. There's a few filters that I wish they would have added. For example, the last 6 months, or the next 6 months, this quarter last year. But they did a great job of adding the most common filters. If none of these filters work for you exactly, you can choose the next to the last item, all dates in the period, and a new drop-down offers the 4 quarters, quarter 1 through quarter 4, and the 12 months. This would allow you to see everything in June or November or quarter 3. Now again, this date filter option only appears if your column contains predominantly dates.